Well, thank you very much for that warm welcome, and thank you, David, for that kind introduction. I do have a bit of a bone to pick with David, though. Earlier this morning, as we walked into the room, I turned to him and remarked, "Wow, what a great crowd you've got, a lot of people." And without missing a beat, he responded to me, "Oh yeah, but when we get some good speakers, we can get 2 or 3 times as many people." Now, that wasn't nearly as bad as the guy that I met at the airport the other night. While I was waiting for my luggage to come off the carousel, this guy comes up to me and he says, "Does anyone ever tell you you look like John Baird?" I smiled and responded, "Yes." And then he says to me, "That must really piss you off." I want to also recognize, that's a true story. I also want to recognize the strong contingent here today from Canada. In Canada, we have 350,000 Jews. They are strong, and they form a very important part of our nation's fabric. Generation after generation, by hard work and by perseverance, Jewish immigrants, often starting with absolutely nothing, have achieved great prosperity. Let me tell you this, Canadian Jews are also immensely proud of what the people of Israel have accomplished, of their courage and generosity, of the remarkable modern nation that they have built. You will also know, almost a year ago, I stepped down as Foreign Affairs Minister of Canada and left political life. When that happened, there may have been a few people, well, perhaps more than a few, who were quite happy to see me go. You can guess who I'm talking about. The anti-Israel gang in the mainstream media, the go-along to get-along crowd at the United Nations, the foreign policy elites in Ottawa, those advocates of the mushy middle, honest broker stuff. But let me tell you this, if they think my passion for Israel will wane, if they think my voice will fall silent, if they think my energy for the Jewish people will diminish, they are dead wrong. I will continue to be an outspoken advocate for the truth, for justice, and for the only liberal democracy in the Middle East, for the only Jewish state. In both Canada and the United States, our generation has inherited one of the very best countries on earth, where freedom, prosperity, and the ability to pursue happiness, one of the best qualities of life in the world. We inherited all of this from the generations that preceded us. My grandfather was part of that great generation. Born here in the United States, he immigrated to Canada as a child, and he left for Europe as a young man and served in the Canadian Armed Forces for 25 years after the war. The great challenges of his generation were first fascism and then communism. Well, the great challenge of our generation is the fight against terrorism. And our generation must respond with the same courage and determination that that great generation did. Friends, far too often, the State of Israel and the Jewish people around the world are on the front lines of that struggle. Whether it's Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in South Lebanon, we must stand with the people of Israel. Whether it is a community center in Buenos Aires or Chabad House in Mumbai, we must stand in solidarity with the Jewish people. And we must call out those who excuse it or attempt to perversely seek to justify it under the guise of moral relativism. I want to tell you about one experience that I had as a young political assistant when I worked for the Minister of Foreign Affairs back in 1993. Every morning, we would get a briefing on what was going on in the world, political, economic, security incidents. And they reported that it was raining in a town called Metula in northern Israel. I would later visit Metula. Canadians take great pride in it. It's where the Canada Centre is, also one of the only hockey rinks in the Middle East is. But when it was raining in Metula, it was not a meteorological event. It was Katyusha rockets coming down indiscriminately on men, women, and children, on hospitals, on schools. And when this was reported to us at that morning meeting, I very naively asked, as a young 23-year-old man, what would Canada do? Should we issue a statement? Should we raise the issue at the United Nations? Should we speak with allies on how to respond? No. No, I was told. And I heard something that I'll never forget. It was reported to those of us in the meeting that, no, we don't get involved. Why? Because it's hard to tell the black hats from the white hats. I sat there, stunned, and started to doodle on the pad of paper in front of me. I wrote I wrote Israel, with a white hat above it. I doodled a black hat and put Hezbollah. And under Israel, I put liberal democracy, and under Hezbollah, I put terrorist organization. It really couldn't be more black and white, in my opinion. And I thought to myself, if I was ever in a position to do something, I would stand up and take a very different approach. Now, never did I imagine the opportunities ahead for me to do just that, some 20 years later. And under these challenging conditions, the Jewish people have built a remarkable state, the most economically prosperous in the entire region, a magnet for jobs, innovation, and for opportunity. Israel has one of the most dynamic economies in the world. Its startup nation philosophy has seen it make incredible strides in science and technology, medicine, in agriculture, and in water management. Israel is also a place where freedom, democracy, and the rule of law flourish. Israel, my friends, is a beacon of light in a part of the world where all too often darkness prevails. When the leading state sponsor of terrorism in the world today, the Islamic Republic of Iran, seeks to expand its power and its influence in the region and the world, friends, we must stand resolute. That it will not be business as usual until Iran's clerical leadership takes a different course. The world and civilized people everywhere cannot and must not allow the proliferation of nuclear weapons throughout the Middle East. And make no mistake about it, that is exactly what will follow if Iran becomes a threshold nuclear state. Iran's political and religious leaders have been clear about what they'd like to do to the Jewish state, and we must ensure that they never obtain the capacity to follow through on that threat. Now, I used to view the Iranian nuclear program almost exclusively through the lens of Israel. But let me tell you, the Arab world is every bit as concerned as each and every one of us at that prospect. Israel, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and just about every Arab state share our strong concerns and our deep-rooted fears. While on many fronts we do have fundamentally different values than some in the region, we do share many of the same concerns. We don't like or support the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and beyond. We both share the concern about the growth of political Islam. Political Islam is fundamentally contrary to democracy and fundamentally contradictory to pluralism, something that makes Canada, the United States, and Israel so great. We deplore the war crimes committed by Assad against his own people. We abhor the rise of ISIL and its brutal methods. And let me tell you, we all share the same concerns and even fears about the regime in Tehran. It especially means we must work together to stand up against its attempts to expand its power and its influence in the region. Notwithstanding our strong and unequivocal support for Israel, Canada's relations with the Arab world are stronger than they have ever been. They might not agree with our position on that one issue, but let me tell you, they respect the moral clarity of our position and of our leadership on so many other fronts in the Middle East. One of the great things that Canada, the United States, and Israel can give to the world is our example. We have built pluralist societies where people from different races, backgrounds, and religions can live in peace and harmony. In far too many parts of the world, we see the reemergence of the scourge of anti-Semitism, and sometimes in places that we had assumed it had all but been eradicated. This was hammered home to me on a recent visit to the old city of Jerusalem. I was traveling with a friend, and we came across a group of young IDF soldiers. He immediately recognized one of them as the son of a family friend who had just made Aliyah from France. And we had a good conversation, and I learned his story. 2 years earlier, I was informed he had been the victim of a hate crime and had been beaten to an inch of his life. And sadly, this was the second such experience. And I cannot tell you how disturbing it was to hear that this could take place in the center of Europe at this point in our history. That's the bad news. The good news is that there was a place to go for him and his family, a place of refuge, a place of hope, a place he could call home, and that place is called Israel, the Jewish state. You know, in a very simple way, that explains the importance of Zionism, of the Zionist dream in the 21st century. And let me tell you, when it comes to combating anti-Semitism, Canada has not remained silent. We aggressively promote pluralism around the world. We've set up an Office of Religious Freedom. We signed the Ottawa Convention on Anti-Semitism. We've become a world leader in Holocaust remembrance and education. Sadly, we have seen the emergence of a new form of anti-Semitism. This one doesn't target the individual Jew, but rather the collective one, the Jewish state, the state of Israel. In many ways, this is just another attempt to make the old bigotry acceptable for a new generation. The amount of time that some put into the propaganda of BDS, boycott, divest, and sanction astounds me. And we must aggressively push back. And we are. Through a memorandum of understanding with Israel, Canada is taking a much more aggressive stance and has been a loud voice on this issue. All of us must not be hesitant nor timid. We must stand up and speak against this. Whether it's on college campuses, in corporate boardrooms, or in union halls, we must not and will not let this mean-spirited sentiment and its venom continue to grow. Let me tell you about one pushback that happened in Toronto. Every year, Toronto holds one of the biggest gay pride parades in the world, and upwards of 1 million people show up. One group entered the parade, calling themselves Queers Against Israeli Apartheid. They assumed there would be no pushback, that they would have an easy ride. Well, my friends, nothing could be further from the truth. They were called out on it. How much time, they were asked, were they spending pushing human rights in every other country in the Middle East, where sexual minorities have no rights, where in fact it can be a death sentence? There was a huge public uproar and the City of Toronto threatened to pull their funding if it happened again the following year. And you see, my friends, the very best weapon we have in this is the truth. Sadly, some in the international community still question the legitimacy of the existence of the State of Israel. And one of their favorite weapons is to deny it the right to defend itself. And after generations of persecution, the Jewish people deserve their own homeland, and they deserve to live safely and peacefully in it. At the end of the day, it all comes down to leadership. You have to have the courage of your convictions and not be afraid to stand up and to be counted. And let me tell you about two such occasions. When I arrived at the Department of Foreign Affairs as minister, I asked why Canada continued to support a slew of anti-Israel resolutions at the United Nations General Assembly. Oh, they're the same resolutions every year. They don't matter, I was told. Well, if they don't matter, why was Canada continuing to join on the pylon and single out Israel for condemnation, I asked. I gave instructions to my officials that we would change each and every vote and align ourselves with the voting record of the United States at the UN. Now, my officials came back and said this would be the biggest change in Canadian foreign policy in a generation, that all hell would break loose and that Canada would face a full Arab trade boycott. One senior official actually went behind my back to the Prime Minister's office to try and see him to stop this crazy minister. The Prime Minister wouldn't see him, and we changed our votes. And let me tell you this, we didn't get a single question in the House of Commons in Ottawa. We didn't get a single question from the Parliamentary Press Gallery. And several weeks later, I traveled to the Middle East and met with the Palestinian Prime Minister, Salam Fayyad, and he didn't even raise the issue with me. When the Palestinians attempted to circumvent peace talks with Israel by going directly to the United Nations General Assembly, I was the only foreign minister in the world to show up to speak for Israel and against the resolution. One political observer asked me on my return a rather snarky question. How did I allow Israel to coerce me into traveling to New York to speak on their behalf when it was inevitable that 90 or 95% of countries at the UN wouldn't support our position? And he was absolutely shocked with my response. I responded that Israel didn't ask for Canada's support. We proactively offered it. You see, supporting Israel is just the right thing to do. As then Prime Minister Stephen Harper told the Knesset last year, it is a Canadian tradition to stand up for what is principled and just, regardless of whether it is convenient or popular. That's leadership. That's leadership, and that's being there for a friend at a tough moment in its history. You know, I am very proud to say that Israel has no greater friend than Canada. I want to conclude my remarks by sharing with you something very special. One of the most meaningful moments of my time in public life happened after I delivered a speech to the American Jewish Committee in Boston. After I spoke, an elderly man came up to me and extended his hand. He introduced himself to me as a Holocaust survivor. And then he said something to me that I'll never forget. He said, "I wish there were more people like you at that time." I am so honored. I'm so honored. I am so honored to have had the privilege to work with Jewish communities throughout Canada and around the world. Working together, we have taken our relationship to new heights. And my friends, working together, we can make that relationship even stronger. Thank you so much. Toda raba.